Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, December the 4th. My name is Pam, and let's begin. Contradicting Trump, Barr dismisses fraud allegations. Attorney General William Barr said the Justice Department has not uncovered evidence of widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election. By Michael Balsamo. Associated Press. In Washington, Attorney General William Barr said Tuesday the Justice Department has not uncovered evidence of widespread voter fraud that would change the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. His comments in an interview with the Associated Press come despite President Donald Trump's repeated baseless claims that the election was stolen. Mr. Trump's efforts to subvert the results of the 2020 presidential election and his refusal to concede his loss to President-elect Joe Biden. Mr. Barr said United States attorneys and FBI agents have been working to follow up specific complaints and information they've received, but they've uncovered no evidence that would change the outcome of the election. Mr. Barr was headed to the White House later for a previously scheduled meeting. To date, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election, Mr. Barr said. The comments are especially direct, coming from Mr. Barr, who has been one of the president's most ardent allies. Before the election, he had repeatedly raised the notion that mail-in voters fraud could be especially vulnerable to fraud during the coronavirus pandemic, as Americans feared going to polls and instead chose to vote by mail. Shortly after Mr. Barr's statement was published, Mr. Trump tweeted out more baseless claims of voter fraud, and his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and his campaign issued a scathing statement claiming that with all due respect to the Attorney General, there hasn't been any semblance of an investigation. Last month, Mr. Barr issued a directive to U.S. attorneys across the country, allowing them to pursue any substantial allegations of voting irregularities if they existed before the 2020 presidential election was certified, despite no evidence at the time of any widespread fraud. That memorandum gave prosecutors the ability to go around long-standing Justice Department policy that normally would prohibit such overt actions before the election was certified. Soon after it was issued, the department's top election crime official announced he would step aside from that position because of the memo. The Trump campaign team, led by Mr. Giuliani, has been alleging a widespread conspiracy by Democrats to dump millions of illegal votes into the system with no evidence. They have filed multiple lawsuits in battleground states alleging that partisan poll watchers didn't have a clear enough view at polling sites in some locations, and therefore something illegal must have happened. The claims have been repeatedly dismissed, including by Republican judges who have ruled the sweeps lacked evidence. Local Republicans in some battleground states have followed Mr. Trump in making similar unsupported claims. Mr. Trump has rallied against the election in tweets and in interviews through his own administration, though his own administration has said the 2020 election was the most secure ever. Mr. Trump recently allowed his administration to begin the transition over to Mr. Biden, but has still refused to admit he lost. The issues Mr. Trump's campaign and its allies have pointed to are typical in every election. Problems with signatures, secrecy envelopes, and postal marks on mail-in ballots, as well as the potential for a small number of ballots to be miscast or lost. But they've also requested federal probes into the claims. Trump campaign attorney Sidney Powell spun fictional tales of election system flipping votes, German servers storing U.S. voting information, and election software created in Venezuela at the direction of Hugo Chavez, the late Venezuelan president who died in 2013. Ms. Powell has since been removed from the campaign's legal team after an interview she gave where she threatened to blow up Georgia with a biblical court filing. Mr. Barr didn't name Ms. Powell specifically, but said, "There's been one assertion that would be systemic fraud, and that would be the claim that machines were programmed essentially to skew the election results. And the Department of Homeland Security and the DOJ have looked into that. And so far, we haven't seen anything to substantiate that." He said people were confusing the use of the federal criminal justice system with allegations that should be made in civil lawsuits. He said such a remedy for those complaints would be a top-down audit conducted by state or local officials, not the U.S. Justice Department. There's a growing tendency to use the criminal justice system as sort of a default fix-all, and people don't like something. They want the Department of Justice to come in and investigate, Mr. Barr said. He said, first of all, there must be a basis to believe there is a crime to investigate. Most claims of fraud are very particularized to a particular set of circumstances or actors or conduct. They are not systemic allegations, and those have been run down. They are being run down, Mr. Barr said. Some have been broad and potentially cover a few thousand votes. They have been followed up on. In the campaign statement, Mr. Giuliani claimed they had gathered ample evidence of illegal voting in at least 6 states, which they have not examined. "We have many witnesses swearing under oath they saw crimes being committed in connection with voter fraud. As far as we know, not a single one has been interviewed by the DOJ. The Justice Department also hasn't audited any voting machines or used their subpoena power to determine the truth," he said. The witnesses Mr. Giuliani has pointed to in the past includes Jesse Jacobs, identified as a City of Detroit employee, who said in an affidavit filed in court that she saw other workers coaching voters to cast ballots for Joe Biden and the Democrats. But a judge who denied a bid to block the certification of Detroit area election results noted that Ms. Jacobs' claim of misconduct and fraud included no date, location, frequency, or names of employees, and that she only came forward with her allegations after the unofficial results indicated Biden had won Michigan. Up next, Storied Narratives Translation Prompts a Fresh Look at the Slave Trade by Lindsay McGinnis. In 1739, everything changed for Brotteer Froreau. The son of a wealthy chieftain in West Africa had just returned home from an apprenticeship when a raiding army attacked their village. According to historians' estimates, Brotteer was only 9 or 10 years old when he watched the raiders kill his father. Like more than 1 million others during the transatlantic slave trade, he was soon marched to the coast of present-day Ghana and sold to American slavers. Standing aboard the charming Suzanne, Brotteer received a new name, Venture, as in purchased as another man's personal business venture. That September, Venture set foot in the New World, and although it would be years before he was able to reclaim his freedom, he never forgot his roots. When he was in his 20s, a particularly violent master threatened to banish Venture if he and his wife Meg resisted the family's abuse. "I crossed the waters to come here," Venture replied, "and I am willing to cross them to return." In a narrative of the life and adventure of Venture, a 30-page memoir considered one of the greatest slave narratives in American history, Venture explains how he overcame bondage and became a widely respected businessman, freeing his entire family and acquiring more than 130 acres in Haddam Neck, Connecticut by the end of his life. After purchasing his freedom, Venture adopted his final slave master's surname, Smith, because of the man's fairness. Venture Smith never returned to Africa, but now his story will. The Documenting Venture Smith project, based in Torrington, Connecticut, in collaboration with scholars from England and Ghana, had translated Smith's 1798 narrative into Fonte, an Akan dialect spoken by roughly 2.7 million people in Ghana's coastal regions. Along with expanded access to Smith's story comes a reckoning. Of the more than 900 slaves voyages sponsored by Rhode Island merchants in the 17th and early 18th century, many of those ships, including the charming Susanna, traded with forts along the Gold Coast. Smith's narrative revealed not only how the institution of slavery shaped places such as Ghana and New England, pushing back on local beliefs that slavery was not important to these regions' histories, but also how Middle Passage survivors demonstrated strength and resilience in the worst possible circumstances. Slavery is not black history, says Keith W. Stokes, vice president of 1696 Heritage Group in Newport, Rhode Island. Black history is how our ancestors survived and thrived despite slavery. And that's exactly what the Venture Smith story provides. A first-person narrative of how an African boy was able to survive the Middle Passage, survive enslavement, and raise a family. Lingua Franca. Chandler Saint, president and co-director of the Documenting Venture Smith project, led the translation effort. We don't know what language was spoken when Venture was born, he says, but we do know is the last language Venture would have heard as he had been taken out by a canoe to the charming Susanna, would have been the Ghana canoemen speaking Fonte. Rebecca Shumway, associate professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and author of The Fonte and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, says the slave trade brought hundreds of years of violence to the region, warfare between states, banditry, kidnapping, as well as commerce and, for some, new power. During this time, Fonte spread from a relatively small area to being the main language spoken from Accra to the Ivory Coast. The Fonte became sort of the ruling elite during the period of the slave trade, and so their language became the lingua franca of trade for the African population, she said. When Dr. Shumway lived in Ghana in the 1990s, she noticed there was very little interest in the slave forts scattered along the coasts or other relics of trade. People were more interested in the legacy of British colonism, which had only ended in 1957, and felt like slavery to many who remembered it. But since then, there's been a growing reverence for these sites, due in part to the rise of heritage tourism and unprecedented access to historic data that reveals how different countries, states, and colonies participated in the transatlantic slave trade. It became possible to actually count the number of voyages, and in most cases, the number of captives aboard those voyages, says Dr. Shumway. Before that, everybody was just guessing. Smith's narrative brings those numbers to life. In Africa, we like telling stories a lot, says Gertrude Afiba Torto, an education lecturer at the University of Cape Coast. And if those stories come in one of Ghana's 11 official languages, even better. The children, especially those at the lower primary level, will appreciate the lesson in their local language because they can better identify with it, says Dr. Tornto, an expanded history for New Englanders. Back across the Atlantic, experts agreed that reconstructing the lives and stories of individuals who experienced slavery is crucial. We developed more information on Venture than existed probably on any other survivor of the Middle Passage, says Robert Pierce Forbes, principal historian of the Documenting Venture Smith project, and that's in large part Venture's doing. Firmly planted in the Northeast, Smith never traveled below Long Island, so his narrative reinforces what Dr. Forbes describes as a growing recognition of the role of slavery played in American northern colonies. Whether it's Brown University joining other colleges in acknowledging its ties to 18th century slavery, or white families confronting their own history, new research is helping to chip away at the notion that slavery was only a Southern phenomenon. In the United States, as in Ghana, Smith's narratives could serve as an invaluable educational tool, expanding the traditional view of early American history, slavery, revolution, and all. A useful comparative written in the same time period as Ventures is Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, said Joanne Pope Mellish, author of Disowning Slavery, Gradual Emancipation and Race in New England, 1780 to 1860, and a visiting scholar in American Studies at Brown University. Franklin also starts out unfree and runs away, but as a white man, he is able to end up a famous patriarch and founding father. Smith begins his life in the New World with no autonomy, and by his self initiated heroic struggles, ends up a successful property owner fulfilling his American dream. Yet, despite efforts by the Documenting Venture Smith Project, more people know the names Brown and Franklin than Venture Smith, says Mr. Stokes. Today, the greatest challenge we face is not simply racism, it's invisibility, he says. We're still telling the story from an owner class or white perspective, and before we have reconciliation with white organizations, you start with recognition. We have to start with the people, which is Venture Smith, and all the African men and women who survived like him. Up next, students lagging behind in math, blame the pandemic, by Carolyn Thompson, Associated Press. A disproportionately large number of poor and minority students were not in schools for assessments that fail. A disproportionately large number of poor and minority students were not in school for assessments this fall, complicating efforts to measure the pandemic's effects on some of the most vulnerable students. A not-for-profit company that administers standardized testing said Tuesday. Overall, NWEA's fall assessment showed elementary and middle school students have fallen measurably behind in math, while most appear to be progressing at a normal pace in reading since schools were forced to abruptly close in March and pick up online. The analysis of data from nearly 4.4 million United States students in grades 3 through 8 represents one of the first significant measures of the pandemic's impact on learning. But researchers of NWEA, whose MAP growth assessments are meant to measure students' proficiency, caution they may be underestimating the effects on students of color and students from economically disadvantaged groups. Those students made up a significant portion of the roughly 1 in 4 students who tested in 2019, but were missing from 2020 testing. NWEA said they may have opted out of the assessments, which were given in person and remotely, because they lacked reliable technology or stopped going to school. We've also seen school district reports of higher levels of absenteeism in many different school districts. This is something to really be concerned about, researcher Megan Kuhfeld said on a call with reporters. The NWEA findings show that, compared to last year, students scored an average of 5 to 10 percentile points lower in math, with students in grades 3, 4, and 5 experiencing the largest drops. English language arts scores were largely the same as last year. NWEA Chief Executive Chris Minich pointed out to the sequential nature of math, where 1 year's skills or deficits carry over into the next year. The challenge around mathematics is an acute one, and it's something we're going to be dealing with even after we get back in school, he said. NWEA compared grade level performance on the 2019 and 2020 tests. It also analyzed students' growth over time, based on how individual students did on assessments given shortly before school closed and those given this fall. Both measures indicated that students are advancing in math, but not as rapidly as in typical years. The finding confirms expectations that students are losing ground during the pandemic, but show those losses are not as great as projections made in the spring that were based in part on typical summer slide learning losses. A November report by Renaissance Learning, Inc., based on its own standardized testing, similarly found trouble setbacks found troubling setbacks in math and lesser reading losses. The Renaissance Learning Analysis looked at results from 5 million students in grades 1 through 8 who took STAR early literacy reading or math assessments in the fall of 2019 and 2020. It found students of all grades were performing below expectations in math at the beginning of the school year, with some grades 12 or more weeks behind. Black, Hispanic, American Indian, and students in schools serving largely low-income families fared worse, but the pandemic so far hasn't widened existing achievement gaps, the Renaissance report said. NWEA said that while it saw some differences by racial and ethnic groups emerging in its data, it was too early to draw conclusions. Andrea Pechina, Assistant Superintendent of Student Services at Golden Plains Unified School District in San Joaquin, California, said his district has scrambled to stem learning loss by issuing devices to all of its students, but the district continues to struggle with connectivity for students at home. Students who are typically 1.5 grades behind are now 2 grades behind, he said. We've really just gone back to basics, where we're focusing on literacy and math. That's all we do, Mr. Pechina said. I feel like we're trying our best, he said. Our students are engaged, but it's not optimal. The learning environment is not optimal. Jeff Amy contributed from Atlanta, Georgia, to this article. And now, in a tough season, how Philadelphia Eagle fans are keeping the faith by Mary Beth McCauley. This is no year to be an Eagles fan, and not only because they're having such a bad season. As elsewhere in sports, the coronavirus can dominate the game. Lincoln Financial Field is eerily quiet. Its only attendees cardboard. Its fan noise engineered. Gone is the team's anthem. Fly, Eagles, fly, a rousing 70,000 voice love song taught to babies in good years at least. In normal times, it brings a proud tear to the eye of everyone who was within a snowball's distance of these parts in 2018. That was when a second-string quarterback with a silly trick play swiped the Super Bowl from the mighty New England Patriots. That was when fans lined the sidewalks 10 deep for a victory parade and committed to memory the expletive-laden speech from the team's center Jason Cleese, who dressed in homage to another Philadelphia love, the Murmurs Parade. Maybe you had to be there. But if social distance is the antithesis of the football experience, maybe the team's off year is an acceptable time for it. During the few brief weeks some fans were allowed in the stadium, many took a pass. If you're not high-fiving, you're not tailgating. If you're not dancing around, I'm really not that interested in it, explained Michael Diaz, devoted season ticket holder and spokesman for the Green Legion, which organizes events and travel for the Philadelphia sports fans. There's a lot of everyone in sports here, as in, what's everyone doing for the game? But COVID-19 has assailed the hearth around which much of the city gathers on Sunday. And today, when the Eagles played the Seattle Seahawks in the Monday Night Football slot, the pandemic has broken things down, segmenting the vast and interconnected community once flocking to the game and packing bars. Jersey Shore decks, city apartment gatherings, and family parties. Fly, Eagles, fly has become a potential super spreader. But people are adapting to COVID-19 days. Deb Kurtz of Pennsylvania's Lancaster County cut her teeth on football, a family passion. She was the game day buddy of her late father, a season ticket holder. The legendary Eagles flanker Tommy McDonald came to her wedding. Now a widow, she's gone to games with her 24-year-old son, Wyatt, typically arriving in Philly by 9 a.m. to make the tailgate rounds. With roughly 30 other regulars, they've traveled to 2 or 3 away games a year. There's also been an occasional wedding of fellow fans or a special non-game related group vacation. These people are family, Ms. Kurtz explained. I can count on these people. They'd probably give you their last dollar if they had to. This year, Ms. Kurtz spends game day with her real family, whose COVID-19 circle is tight. They've brought the TV outside and raised a tent for the season opener. Now she heatedly argues football in person with her brother, to the chagrin of her sister-in-law. Her father-in-law, being a Dallas Cowboy fan, is not welcome, or at least that's what they're telling people. Her mom, who spent much of the spring isolated in assisted living, told the family when they were watching the game one recent Sunday, "I love this." In the bleak days of March, Ms. Kurtz formed a Facebook page for her traveling group, and now they meet each week via Zoom. One Thursday evening this month, they were in no rush to talk Eagles, instead catching up with each other's week. When talk turned to the recent elections, Miss Kurtz's family pivoted to the birds and the pace picked up, with the same surly commiserating normally done in person. The injuries, the bad trades, the coaching problems, there were profanity, hyperbole teasing, and trash talk, all the angst of the fans interspersed with reliving sports highlight pasts. What makes football such a magnet? Some say it's the value, motivation, overcoming adversity, getting knocked down and getting back up. The great Green Bay Packer coach Vince Lombardi famously compared the game to life itself. It teaches that work, sacrifice, perseverance, competitive drive, selflessness, and respect for authority is the price that each and every one of us must pay to achieve any goal that is worthwhile. Plus, the game is easy to understand, according to fans at least, and it's easy to plan for, since it usually happens on a Sunday. People can disagree vigorously, can argue about play calling, the pass rush, or other points seemingly trivial without damage to a friendship. And there's the overt patriotism, the flyovers, the show of first responder pride, especially the national anthem. Of course, the anthem itself has been the center of a controversy so heated that it is widely seen as the cause of NFL rating declines in recent years. Whether or not taking a knee during the national anthem, a movement Colin Kaepernick began in 2016 to draw attention to racial inequalities, is disrespectful to the nation, the flag, or veterans. The injecting of politics into the game alienates many who see sports as unified across racial lines. Business has fallen 90% this year for Joe Abruzzo, longtime owner of Bayou Bar and Grill in Philadelphia, which fans usually pack to the rafters on game day. He believes football drift into policies contributed to the drop, or into politics, contributed to the drop. Whether the Bayou will survive the virus and the politics is unclear. People come here to relax and be entertained, he said, and it's really hard for people to come in without bringing in what's outside. This player said this, and this one said that. The fact of being fellow fans typically bridges identity differences, especially when it comes to playing heated rivals. For the Eagles, that would be the All-American multi-Super Bowl winning, do no wrong Cowboys. Our livelihoods and our values and the direction of the country don't depend on the outcome of ball games, and a strong geographical culture identity and an us versus them mentality actually spice up the whole enterprise, observed Mike Sealski in his Philadelphia Inquirer sports column recently. When one city sports executive recently suggested a reimagining of the Philadelphia fan, retiring the lunch bucket battery throwing jail in the stadium stereotype for a new Philadelphia narrative focusing on the arts, culture, education, and diversity, he got an old Philly style boo. The blinkered passion for the local team, the fans-based long institutional memory, the self-identification as underdogs, it's a big part of what makes Philadelphia sports so much fun, wrote Mr. Sealski. For some actual on-field fun, fans here look to the future. Maybe the team will rebuild, get healthy. Welcome back, Travis Fulgham, the receiver who came out of nowhere to become this year's silver lining. Next season, Tom Brady's coming to town with the Buccaneers, and there's a big on-the-road matchup with the Las Vegas Raiders. Everyone's going to Vegas, predicts Mr. Diaz. Everyone here knows that the thing with feathers is hope. Our next article, Desert Mystery Deepens. Did the Utah monolith go to Romania? 10 days after wildlife biologists spotted a mysterious monolith in the Utah desert, it has disappeared. No one knows where it came from or where it's gone. Meanwhile, a similar structure has appeared in the hills of Romania. By Lindsay Whitehurst, Associated Press. In Salt Lake City, a mysterious silver monolith that was placed in the Utah desert has disappeared less than 10 days after it was spotted by wildlife biologists performing a helicopter survey of bighorn sheep, federal officials and witnesses said. We have received credible reports that the illegally installed structure, referred to as the monolith, has been removed from Bureau of Land Management, or the BLM, public lands by an unknown party on November 27th. BLM spokesperson Kimberly Finch said in a statement, "The agency did not remove the structure," she said. Utah State Department of Public Safety and wildlife biologists counting bighorn sheep from state helicopters spotted the monolith on November 18th, a report that garnered international attention. It was about 11 feet tall, with sides that appeared to be made of stainless steel. Meanwhile, another silver monolith has popped up in the hills of Piatra Neamț, Romania. The town's local newspaper reported that this structure is 10 to 12 feet tall and reflective, like the one found in Utah, according to NPR. My guess is that some alien, cheeky and terrible teenagers left home with their parents' UFO and started planting metal monoliths around the world, first in Utah and then in Piatra Neamț, says Andre Carabella, the town's mayor, in a statement posted to Facebook. "I am honored that they chose our city." Back in the United States, Utah police said they won't be opening a major investigation into the disappearance of their mysterious silver-colored monolith that generated international attention and a mess when curious visitors made their way to the site of the discovery in Utah desert. The sheriff in San Juan County says the office doesn't have the resources to devote much time and energy to the taking of the object, which was illegal to begin with because it was placed without permission amid red rocks on a remote section of public land. Its creator also remains a mystery. Utah officials did not say specifically where the monolith was located, but people soon found it through satellite images dating back to 2016 and determined its GPS coordinations. Hundreds of people came to see it after the gleaming, almost otherworldly object garnered widespread attention as a literal bright spot in a sea of grim news during the pandemic. Authorities are accepting tips from anyone who saw anything suspicious related to the discovery. Visitors parked vehicles on plants and left behind waste, according to the BLM. The site doesn't have a parking lot, bathrooms, or cell phone coverage, and some passenger cars had to be towed from the remote area after getting stuck. The site is now empty except for a piece of metal covering a hole where the monolith had stood. The land agency reminded any would-be visitors that driving off of designated roads in the area is illegal. Reporters with the Salt Lake Tribune hiked to the spot on Saturday and confirmed that it was gone. Spencer Owen of Salt Lake City said he saw the monolith Friday afternoon and camped in the region overnight. But as he hiked to the area again on Saturday, people passing him on the trail warned him it was gone, the Tribune reported. But when he arrived at the spot, all that was left was a piece of metal covering a triangular-shaped hole in the rocks. "I was really bummed," said Mr. Owens, who posted a video on Instagram. "It was so pretty and shiny. I wanted to go see it again." Ricardo Marino and his girlfriend Sierra Van Meter were traveling from Colorado to California on Friday and decided to stop and see the object after finding the GPS coordinates online. "This was just a once-in-a-lifetime experience that we couldn't miss," Mr. Marino told KUTV. On the way, they passed a long bed truck with a large object in the back, and he said, he joked, "Oh look, there's the Utah monolith right there." When they arrived at the spot, it was gone. Steve Adams said he left Helper in central Utah at 7 a.m. Saturday to drive to the area, where he arrived and asked someone for directions. He was told the tower was gone. He and some friends made the hike anyway. "It was pretty disappointing," he told the Tribune. "We were really excited to go down and have an adventure to see it. It feels like it was everybody's, and then it was nobody's. It's gone." Well, friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, December the 4th. My name is Pam. Please stay safe, you be abundantly blessed, and do what you can do to make today a really great day.